Hey everyone, it's Kyle Stelter here. I'm the past president of the Wild Sheep Society BC. Welcome to episode number 2 where talk is sheep. And today we're going to talk about all things Moby. We just had a recent event in BC here. We've had 2 lambs that were put down in the South Okanagan. And again, the disease issue is rearing its ugly head here in British Columbia as it is across many of the landscapes in Western North America. So we're joined today by of course, Steve Hamilton, my co-host, and we've got Projects Terror from the Wild Sheep Society of BC, Chris Barker here, and today we have a special guest. We're really happy to have Kevin Hurley. He's Vice President of the Wild Sheep Foundation and has been doing the heavy lifting for wild sheep and conservation for literally decades. So welcome, everybody. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go around the room, and Steve, talk a little bit about what's going on with you, and then we'll pass the torch to Chris and finally Kevin. So.
Not much is new up here. We finally got some summer here in Prince George. So for those that don't know me, I am vice chair of the communications committee for the Wild Sheep Society and do a lot of the social media stuff there. And Kyle's co-host. So over to you, Chris.
Yeah, Chris Barker, past director of the Wild Sheep Foundation. Again, project chair for Wild Sheep Society BC. Had a lot of media interviews this week. Around the Moby issue. So just trying to get that amped up towards ag and make sure ag actually starts to move forward. They've been dragging their feet a little bit. So we need to just get the public and our members to put some pressure on our politicians to move forward with this issue.
Sounds good. Kevin?
Yeah, Kevin Hurley. I'm living in southwestern Idaho where it was triple digit degrees yesterday. You can see I got scalded out on the lake with my grandson. But yeah, I work for the Wild Sheep Foundation. I'm vice president for conservation, 10 years now, but I've been involved for 40 years with the Wild Sheep Foundation in some capacity during my 30 years with the state of Wyoming, and then 10 years on staff. So I joke that, when wild sheep came across the land bridge, 13,000 years ago, I was right behind them. So I've been at this a while, but I'm happy to participate, and obviously British Columbia holds a special place in my heart.
Well, Kevin, you've done a ton of work for wild sheep. Just can you give us a little bit of your background in Wyoming, what you're doing there in the state, and your history with the state of Wyoming there?
Yeah, so I like to say it's 44 years since I finished my undergraduate degree and been a wildlife biologist since then. Of course, I dealt with everything with the state of Wyoming Game and Fish Department. I always joke from mice to moose and wolves to waterfowl, but mountain sheep and mountain goats were always a particular interest to me. And so I did my graduate work at the University of Wyoming, working on what was called the trout, or what is called the Trout Peak Bighorn Sheep Herd, located between Cody and Yellowstone Park. And so that was really my baptism into the wild sheep world. And it was funded by FNAS, which is the Foundation for North American Wild Sheep. Now we do business as the Wild Sheep Foundation, but we have a 45-year history, and I've been involved 40 of those 45 years. So I do go back a ways with the outfit.
I appreciate that, Kevin. So, Kevin, I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding by the general public about wild sheep numbers. Some people think they're healthy. It's something we don't normally see in BC here. You might get the opportunity to see some driving through the Rockies or on the Alaska Highway going up north, but wild sheep have had quite a pendulum. They've had strong numbers, and then they were weakened and stuff. Can you give us a bit of a history of historic numbers of wild sheep dating back centuries, and then modern day numbers and where we're sitting?
Sure, and of course nobody can go back and validate the estimates from early times, but in 1920s there was a famous naturalist here in the States called Ernest Thompson Seton, and Seton came out with an estimate that was based on his observation and people he had talked to. Obviously, he didn't survey everything, but he projected 1.5 to 2 million wild sheep in the West. And, with what we know now about fine scale habitat selection, et cetera, there's some folks that are working on modeling, truly what was that number. And so if 1.5 to 2 million is high, it's probably safe to say there were 1 million plus. And so, now for bighorn sheep, which includes both Rocky Mountain and desert bighorn, and Rocky Mountain being taxonomically equivalent to California bighorn, Ovis canadensis canadensis, there's probably fewer than 90,000 bighorns in all the western states, Alberta and British Columbia, and the 6 states in Mexico. So if you look at Seaton's estimate of 1.5 to 2 million bighorns in the West, say we're even at 100,000, which would be generous, we're at a fraction of what was here historically. At best, 10% of historic range. And you look at a lot of the big game animals in the West that were, driven down in numbers by westward expansion. Those have all made a comeback. The two that haven't, in my opinion, and a lot of others share this feeling, are bison and bighorns. And so elk, deer, whitetail, mule deer, pronghorn, wild turkey, they've all come back, but bison and bighorn continue to struggle. And so some of the earliest maps were put together in the States in the mid-1950s by a guy from California named Helmut Buchner. And it's really an incredible set of maps. And of course, back then they used a big thick crayon to draw maps versus now it's fine scale digitized GIS type capability that didn't exist then. But if you look at a snapshot in time, over time, you can see rather wide, really wide distribution of bighorn sheep, even into states like the Dakotas, Nebraska. And then by the 1950s, they shrunk down. There were probably fewer than 25,000 bighorn left west-wide. And now we've climbed back almost 3 to 4 times that, but a long ways yet to go. And so the Wild Sheep Foundation and all of our chapters and affiliates, and the Wild Sheep Society of British Columbia is one of our most active affiliates. We have probably 30 sheep-specific chapters and affiliates. Our motto, our mission, our purpose is to put and keep wild sheep on the mountain. And so in the early days, we spent a lot of our resources transplanting sheep in places like Alberta and British Columbia, which were blessed with a lot of bighorn sheep. They did some in-province movements, but they were also generous enough to share their bighorn resource with many of the Western states. And so if you look at a mapping project that I started in 1996, that it took 19 years to finish, we've got records and maps of every wild sheep translocation ever done. And British Columbia has been incredibly generous. In fact, California bighorn that occur in 7 states all started from the junction herd at Williams Lake back in 1954, the year I was born. So BC has been an incredible partner for bighorn restoration, attempted bighorn restoration in the Western US. So one of the things that I key in on is in Northwestern Wyoming, where I spent 30 plus years working on sheep. They talk about the sheep eater Indians, the mountain Shoshone, and Tukadika is the name of their peoples. But their whole culture evolved with and around bighorn sheep. They hunted them, they drove them into pits, they harvested them, they made weapons like horn curl bows. All their clothing was made from really fine leather. The food, the implements, spoons, ladles, whatever. Their whole culture depended on mountain sheep in what are called the Absaroka Mountains. And so when you think about the early mountain men, when they went through and wrote down journals and diaries, they talked about, uncountable numbers of bighorns in certain parts of the greater Yellowstone. And I would imagine there were portions of British Columbia just like that. Unfortunately, that's not the case today.
So Kevin, what you mentioned that we're back to that maybe close to 100,000 bighorns now. What was the demise? You said as low as 10,000 or 20,000. I think the number you quoted. What was that demise? What's the main contributor to that? And why the success? Obviously, Wild Sheep Foundation's played a role in that in their chapter and affiliates. But what precipitated the decline, do you think? And then why the success recently?
If you go back through the literature, there's 3 things that keep popping up One is unregulated harvest. A lot of these bighorns lived in river, valley bottoms, canyons, etc. When railroads went through, it took a lot of game meat to feed, a man camp of, 1,000 workers on a rail line. And so unregulated harvest certainly is viewed as a component of why wild sheep numbers went down. Another one has to do with forage competition. For a long time, in the niche that they occupy, bighorn sheep didn't really have more mouths to compete with. Well, when livestock came west, both cattle and domestic sheep came west, to open up the West and settle the West, if you will, there were all of a sudden millions more mouths on the ground looking for that same grass forage. And so forage competition certainly had to play a huge role, but one that we didn't really know about, that I think if we knew then what we know now, maybe it would have panned out differently. But there are some respiratory bacteria that domestic sheep and goats can carry and can transmit, that they do affect domestic sheep somewhat in terms of weight gain, things like that, lamb survival. But when those same pathogens are transferred to wild sheep, they're pretty lethal, and so an analogy I've drawn has to do with Native Americans. When those early settlers came west, European ancestry, they brought things like chickenpox, smallpox, cholera, pathogens that the Native Americans had no natural resistance to. And look at the impact that had on, tribes around the West. And so I think it is analogous that, wild sheep, at least in North America, are not that old when you think about how long they've been here across the Bering Land Bridge. If you look at old world wild sheep in China, Mongolia, Russia, a lot of the countries that are now in Central Asia, they probably have had thousands of years of contact and exposure to grazing animals, domestic goats, domestic sheep, whatever over in the old world. And I think it's relatively new, maybe 150 years of exposure here. And so what we see is, and it's not absolute, and I heard a great analogy one time, who all, raise your hand if you've ever smoked a cigarette. Well, I have smoked some cigars after some wildfires, and we thought we were in Fat City making hazard pay and drinking beer and smoking cigars. Has everybody that ever smoked cancer smoked a cigarette died of lung cancer? No. And so does every time there's contact between a domestic sheep and a wild sheep result in a die-off of bighorn sheep? No. But the preponderance of evidence says it's a serious, serious consequence for bighorns. And so there's so many pathogens, and I'm not a parasitologist or a microbiologist. I'm a wild sheep manager. I've been that for my adult life. And so here's my simple-minded read of this is, and I heard a great analogy from a colleague, and I won't identify her at the moment, but she said, imagine going into a bar. The four of us are going to go in and have a beer. Well, at the door, there's probably a bouncer, and he's going to be checking IDs and making sure a guy like Steve is over 21 and has his ID with him. So the bouncer is going to be the first gatekeeper, if you will, to let people into that bar to have a beer. And I've got some great jokes, but I won't spend time on those right now. About four guys walked into a bar. But that bouncer, if somebody comes in that can knock the crap out of that bouncer, and all of a sudden that bouncer is laid unconscious at the door of that saloon, everybody can come in. And so the analogy, again, is that Mycoplasma ovidiumonae, to me, is a setup artist. It is the bacteria that, knocks out that bouncer, and then the door's wide open for other things to come in. And what MOV does, that's the abbreviation for Mycoplasma pneumoniae. You know, if one of us has a cold, or thank God, hopefully no coronavirus, but if one of us has an infection, a cold, and you want to cough something up and spit it out, in your windpipe, there's all these little beating hairs called cilia. And so that's what helps, work this stuff up out of your lungs and helps you expel it. Well, MOV, that bacteria, what it does is it collapses or paralyzes those little beating cilia, so they just hang limp. So anything that goes in the windpipe sinks, and they can't expel it. And so if you have, like, imagine these 2 lambs at Vaso Lake that had to be put down, chances are the lower lobes of their lungs are consolidated with fluid. And when a wildlife vet does a necropsy, or a sheep manager opens one up and looks at it, you can see the lower lobes of the lung are just full of fluid. And they talk about it being 15% consolidated, or 40% consolidated, or 90% consolidated. But just imagine drowning in your own bodily fluids. That scares the crap out of me. I have a 1.5-year-old grandson that I'm trying to help teach swim, and I do not take my eyes off him in the pool. But I think, good God, if he went under, imagine the feeling. And I'm not anthropomorphizing the sheep, but they drowned in their own bodily fluids. They cannot expel that. And so their pulmonary capacity is reduced, and they're just so compromised that, say there's a coyote or a golden eagle or a mountain lion or something comes along, they're easy prey. So it's not only a direct mortality, but it facilitates indirect mortality. So the tragedy of this is, bighorn do have their own die-offs, bighorn on bighorn transmission. It happens, but those tend to be quite a bit less in terms of significance. Mortalities, maybe 10 or 15% of a population may suffer and die. But when some of these respiratory bacteria get in, it can wipe out an entire bighorn population. There have been many examples around the West, US and Canada, and I would gather Mexico, if data had been available, where bighorns are wiped out because of these periodic respiratory pneumonia outbreaks. And then the really compounded tragedy is that if an animal survives, a bighorn, say a ewe, survives, she might be a carrier, and she might shed that bacteria for years. And so any subsequent lambs that she might have, or her sisters and their lambs, they can spread that beyond 1 year's occurrence. So some researchers have coined the term super shedders, so that every time an animal is tested, they're positive, they're shedding MOV bacteria and perhaps other respiratory bacteria as well. And so it's really frustrating, and there's a lot of work going on, including good work in the province, to try and figure out how to identify those super shedders, those chronic shedders of MOV. And if you can somehow remove them from the population, it's kind of like the typhoid Mary analogy from the Middle Ages. Get rid of those that are most infective, and do you get a bump in lamb production, lamb survival? Perhaps. It's been shown in South Dakota. It's being worked on in Hell's Canyon between Oregon, Idaho, Washington. It's helping on the Fraser there in the province. So there's a lot of good work trying, but it's a defensive reaction to a contact that should have been avoided in the first place.
So Kevin, there's 2 things I want to go back to, but the first one, can you just back it up? So we're talking lots about MOV now, which obviously is the biggest offender for us currently, but in your 40 years on the landscape, there's been an evolution. So there's been a ton of work done by the University of Western Washington. Dr. Tom Besser, Dr. Sri were very involved with on the science end of things. Can you just talk a little bit to the science and the evolution? I know MOV does date back to the 70s. I think it was documented in Australia in the 70s, perhaps, is what I've seen. But can you talk a little bit about the evolution of the science aspect and I think a lot of us, me included, hear a movie and we think that that's the only thing that are affecting wild sheep, but we know that's not true. So could you talk a little bit about the history and the evolution that you've seen, and maybe a little of those early days, and how the science has evolved a little bit in your eyes in that time?
Sure. And so I think this coronavirus, COVID-19 pandemic that we're all dealing with fallout, and hopefully none of you guys have had family or close friends that have succumbed. My little grandson was positive for COVID, but he's out of it. And, he's 20 months old, an old boy. But the point I'm making is look at the diagnostic techniques that exist now compared to 1970, 50 years ago. And so a lot of the samples that were taken from sick or dead bighorn 30, 40, 50 years ago, the technology and the ability to detect those pathogens simply didn't exist like it does now. I mean, there's all kinds of genetic markers, looking at what's called PCR analysis. It's too long of a term to even try to explain, but, there's antibodies, so the diagnostic ability has evolved through time. And what's really enlightening, and fortunately, the province, Dr. Helen Schwanche, who's been the wildlife veterinarian for British Columbia for, I first met Helen in 1986, so at least 35 years. She has a lot of archived samples from the old days, when there were sick or dead bighorns found. And hopefully if there's blood or tissue material that can be rerun now, it would be interesting to know, did they have what we think they have now, but we just couldn't detect that 20, 30, 40 years ago. And so every year, the technology advances. I think Dr. Besser at Washington State University, he's retired now, Dr. Shree before him, have done remarkable work, they and their students, to the point of, some handheld, and I'm holding up my iPhone, a little unit and a gizmo this big, that it's kind of like Dr. McCoy in Star Trek, you could hover that over the patient and tell what was wrong. And so this biomeme unit that I know was deployed on the Fraser project by the BC folks is, there's still glitches, but it's incredible technology now that we didn't have then. And so for a long time, the biggest thing I remember when I started was stress-induced pneumonia and the whole lungworm pneumonia complex. And they talked about the lungworm called Protostrongyla stylosi, which was something they could detect back then. They couldn't detect a lot of the fine diagnostic analytics that they can do now. And so, I remember reading early on about, in Wyoming, thousands of dead bighorn up a place called the Grable River. And the outward manifestation was seroptes or scabies. It's a mange caused by mites in the ear canal. And so I know British Columbia and the state of Washington are dealing with that along the Similkameen and the border on either side of the international border. But that's an obvious one. It's an external parasite. And so Helmut Buchner's 1960 monograph on bighorn of the U.S. talked about, the reports of thousands of dead bighorns up the Grable River. They died from the scab. Well, scabies was manifested, but they had no way of looking internally and seeing what the lungs looked like. And so it's exciting. It's frustrating. You wish we knew all that we needed to know about it. It's still not an exact science. There's a lot of questions about it, but I think it's safe to say, and I heard this, by one of the former specialists that worked on this, is, a simple equation that, domestic sheep plus bighorn sheep equals dead bighorn sheep. That was his abbreviated formula, and it's probably not that grim, but it's probably not too far off either. And so there are adverse consequences when contact occurs. Maybe it's mild, maybe it's like smoking that cigar, it didn't kill me, but it might have weakened me. but I think there's a lot of awareness now on the part of not only the agencies, the researchers, but I think on the part of sportsmen and women, conservationists who keep reading about this stuff, and it's like, oh my God, this is happening again. So the province, for example, has gone through, the South Okanagan die-off, and then Chasm. Look at that herd has dropped by 90% or more. The Fraser is a fraction of what it was historically, and now this new one at Vaso Lake in the Penticton Valley, or in the Penticton area. It's really frustrating. We're 45 years in the making. We started out to put wild sheep on the mountain. About 10 years ago, we morphed our mission statement to say to put and keep wild sheep on the mountain. We don't want to just transplant them. There have been 1,600 different transplants, probably 23,000 bighorns that have been moved between jurisdictions through time. So it's an important management tool, but you can't just keep rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic without saying, whoa, 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 time out. What is causing this problem? And repeatedly, it indicates contact between domestic sheep or goats and wild sheep usually lead to adverse consequences for wild sheep.
Okay, good, Kevin. On that note, so we have this, let's talk a little bit of Moby now, because it obviously is coming up as one of the biggest offenders in addition to these other diseases that sheep have been exposed to. But is there any sign of a cure? Is there anything that, like obviously separation, you're referring to that, and clearly that's the best scenario, but that's one of the challenges that we're dealing with in our wild sheep community, which we'll talk to later. But do we have any cures? Is there anything we can do? Is there anything that's been effective in combating Moby?
Look at COVID. Everybody's holding their breath waiting for a vaccine to come out. And look at the trials that are underway, and probably dozens of companies globally trying to come up with a vaccine. It's my understanding that there are no vaccines for MOV and pasteurellosis, respiratory pneumonia in bighorn. There have been some trials done, including some work in British Columbia, to try and treat domestic sheep and clean them up, so to speak, get rid of these pathogens, especially in a high-risk context scenario. But I think it needs a lot more work, replicate trials, publication, peer review, critical review. That's how science advances. People, do a project, gather some results, test some hypotheses, publish about it, and then everybody else takes a shot. And if they can replicate it or they can tear it apart, that's how science and knowledge advances. And so I think we know a whole lot more about respiratory pneumonia in bighorn sheep than we did certainly 40 years ago when I started. But it's not absolute crystal clear. But I think, one of the things that I have always thought about is more likely than not, or the preponderance of evidence suggests, is it ironclad? Is it foolproof, bulletproof, 100%? Maybe not, but it's more likely than not that this keeps happening when contact occurs between domestic sheep or goats and wild sheep. And it scares the hell out of me and many others. You look at the stone sheep in British Columbia, recent taxonomic genetic work says stone sheep occur in British Columbia, some in the Yukon, but British Columbia has, in my mind, a global responsibility to manage for stone sheep and protect their habitat. And so one of the things that I'm aware of was, and if I butcher the acronym, I apologize, but a government action regulation, a GAR order for the northern part of the province that said on Crown land, there won't be domestic sheep or goats or other critters that can harbor and transmit these pathogens allowed on somebody's place, or certainly on Crown land within, I think, 50K of occupied stone sheep or mountain goat range. Mountain goats also are susceptible to these pathogens. So I think there's been a lot of an awakening, a wake-up call in the last 7 to 10 years for Dall sheep and stone sheep, thin horn sheep managers and advocates. It's like we don't ever want them to go down the same path that bighorn have in the southern provinces and then the western states. And so I think it's incumbent on every jurisdiction, and there are 21 jurisdictions in the US and Canada that have wild sheep in them, plus 6 states in Mexico. So there's 27 states, provinces, and territories that have wild sheep. And that's one of the things that we've tried to advocate for is cooperation, sharing of data, sharing of information. You know, right now, Texas is undergoing a respiratory pneumonia die-off in desert bighorn along the Rio Grande. And so information that maybe British Columbia has come up with that could share and help Texas is really beneficial. You know, things that California has found out maybe benefit North Dakota as well. So I'm really excited by what we've learned, but I'm personally, you know, I plan to live forever, but in case I get that wrong, I'd sure like to see something happen in my lifetime, you know, to address this situation and realize, and this is a mantra of mine, and I am a multiple use public lands advocate, there is room on the landscape for both domestic sheep and wild sheep, but it cannot be together, is how I roll and what I advocate for.
Fantastic, Kevin. Well, that's great information. Just one last question for you here before we let you go. What have you seen historically has been the biggest die-off or sort of worst case scenario that you've seen in wild sheep across the landscape, whether BC or otherwise, maybe numbers wise or percentage wise? I know there's lots of cases of that where there's been all age die-offs, but what have you kind of seen as a worst case scenario for wild sheep?
You know, a classic example is Hell's Canyon, shared between the states of Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. You know, there was a bighorn die-off that started there in the mid-90s, either 95, 96 or 96, 97. But, you know, it's incredible country. It's you know, we had one of our former board members that estimated, oh, you know, you could have 10,000 bighorn in Hell's Canyon. And I think numbers are around 700, 900 perhaps. So again, a fraction of what's possible. You look at the last 3 to 5 years in the Mojave Desert, you know, for a long time, desert bighorn didn't have to deal with this. They damn sure are now. And there's been huge die-offs and reduction in wild sheep numbers in the California and Nevada portions of the Mojave, and even northwestern Arizona in the Black Mountains. And so, you know, bad pun, but, you know, you could blindfold and throw a dart. And I think any jurisdiction that's had wild sheep, none of them have escaped this. And so British Columbia, you know, I thank goodness for what BC has and what it's held on to, you know, and Alberta. But as we all know, both those provinces are changing, you know, and people are coming in and things are not what they were 100 years ago. And so we just all need to do our damnedest to hold on to this resource. And again, it's so frustrating when you think about the comeback that elk, whitetail, mule deer, pronghorn, turkeys have had, but bison and bighorn, they're still struggling. And so, you know, die-offs keep happening. I can't close my eyes and visualize a single jurisdiction that has not experienced a respiratory pneumonia die-off to some extent.
Okay, yeah, fantastic. That's good information. So obviously lots of doom and gloom around disease. Are there any beacons of light or hope out there that you see? Anything that on the horizon, or you know, have you seen any cases where you're pretty excited about things? Anything out there that gives you hope for the future with wild sheep, Kevin?
Yeah, there are. You know, if not, I'd have a hard time getting up in the morning and going to work every day. But you know, some jurisdictions are doing really well, like Nevada, for example. You know, they probably have more wild sheep in Nevada than any other jurisdiction I'm aware of. And yet they're only maybe less than 1/3 of their historic range is currently occupied. So I think there's great opportunity for growth, you know. And so just joking, but somewhat serious, you know, take a look at Clark County, where Las Vegas sits. You know, you're not going to roll the clock back and undo all the housing around Las Vegas. And so, there are certain places that are no longer suitable for wild sheep, but to us in the Wild Sheep Foundation, in the wild sheep world, where there is still historic and still suitable habitat, that's where we should focus on to try and get populations either started or augmented if they're struggling. And so, yeah, one of the biggest positives I'll take out of it is, I think, just the awareness and the interaction between our agencies and the publics that are interested in wild sheep. Wasn't that many decades ago when we really didn't have much of a presence. Social media like podcasts, Zoomcasts, are incredible at disseminating information. I think British Columbia came up with a really good app for your smartphones that, if you see mountain goat kids or you see bighorn lambs or stone lambs, Bill Jackson, some of the IT people with the ministry came up with a really good app that's widely used. And, citizen engagement, advocate engagement, to me is really encouraging. As I read the things on whatever social media that I follow, and I'm not a high-end user, but it's really encouraging that so many, obviously younger than me, but so many young people are clued in now and hear about this stuff. And it's like, well, damn it, we don't want this to happen sort of on our watch. What can we do? And so to me, just the level of interest in wild sheep conservation across the Western US and Canada, and even in Mexico, where there's been a lot of effort to turn sheep loose, not high fence, but back into open range, let them live on the mountain that they're supposed to. And to me, that's what I take the greatest motivation from, is everybody's interest and willingness to do the hard work, but also ask the hard questions and expect accountability from our government agencies, whether they're state or federal or provincial.
Fantastic, Kevin. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you taking the time to meet with us today. And on behalf of all wild sheep advocates, I just can't thank you enough for all the work that you do as Vice President of the Wild Sheep Foundation and what you've done the last 40 years. And just our hats off to the Wild Sheep Foundation for their leadership in the conservation arena. And just on a more of a regional level, thank you for your support with the Wild Sheep Society BC. You're a life member, a Monarch member, and you're always the first to step up to support us in our initiatives. So can't thank you enough. And thank you for taking the time to meet with us today. We're going to let you get back to your Sunday afternoon and appreciate all your time.
All right, I'm proud to be a member of the society, and I appreciate all that you guys do. And so keep it up. I'll help any way I can. I figure I'm just getting warmed up after 40 years.
Fantastic. Have a great day. Thanks, Kevin.
Alrighty.
All right. Well, that was an excellent introduction to disease and some of the issues facing the wild sheep community. And Kevin's very knowledgeable in BC as well. But Chris has been doing a ton of work here at the legislature and working with agriculture on wild sheep. And we're working on a few things that we're going to roll out in the next day or two here as well. So we're going to jump into what's going on in BC on the disease front. So Chris, if you don't mind, let's just jump into what you've been doing. You and I have been working closely with the Minister of Agriculture. We've been meeting with Lana Popham since I think April of 2017 was it was April 2018 was our first meeting with the Ag Minister, and we've got a lot of support there from her, and she's been very proactive and very willing to meet with us. So we're really thankful there. So why don't you just talk about the work that we've done there and the engagement we've had there and sort of where things are headed in that direction.
Yeah, just before I jump into that, Kyle, I just, it's too bad Kevin jumped off there, but I was just going to say that a lot of the disease research has been funded by wild sheep advocacy groups, WSF, through Washington State University. And, I think that's, kind of where we're going to lead into is where does government fit into this, and how come they haven't stepped up? How come they haven't been part of that research, or how come they haven't done those dollars? Why have they left it to an NGO to do that? And I think that comes back to exactly where we're going to dive into is, where we've been with ag. It's, I often joke, I've educated 2 or 3 ministers, some ADMs. You go through that and you think, well, Kevin's response too, right? 20 years we've been doing this. So why can't we get the politicians to actually act on this? So I think, with what we're doing and where we're going in the campaign we're looking at doing is going to help move that dial forward a bit. But exactly like you said, Kyle, Minister Poppin's been fantastic to deal with. I think COVID came along at the wrong time for sheep, in the sense that ag had to focus on some other issues. But coming to where we have a strategic group that's made up from Flinro staff, ag staff, one representative from the Domestic Sheep Federation, one member from the Goat Federation, and then ourselves as a wild sheep NGO, and then Jeremy, the sheep separation coordinator, along with ag staff, actually set up the meetings and starting to drive, hopefully, towards some policy and regulation. Right now, we've just compiled a document. Ag paid for Kezia Manlap to do compile all the documentation and most of the science that was out there, and that documentation just came out. So that's a piece of the puzzle. It was one of those knowledge gaps that was identified. We should see that at the beginning of September. And once we have that, that may start to drive hopefully some direction of what we can do to either separation or get producers on board, or not, to have their sheep in certain areas or high risk areas. So it'll be interesting to see where that policy component goes, but that's the abbreviated version of it.
So Chris, let's talk a little bit about what we're looking for as a society. So there's actually two components. There's a northern component, and Kevin referenced that with the GAR order, the Government Action Regulation Order. So there's that component, which is actually a Flinro issue, I believe. I'm correct in saying that. And then we also have the ag issue, which is more of a southern issue, right? So can we kind of talk a little bit about what we're looking for in those two areas? And when we get in the GAR order, I've got a few questions for you around that as well. So maybe talk about southern BC and what's happening there and what we're looking for, what we want to see from the Ministry of Agriculture, what we're after.
Yeah, and I think, when our first discussion started with ag, they actually started to look at thin horn sheep as maybe that low hanging fruit, but exactly what you said, Kyle. Everything down south from the Kootenays over to the Fraser is highest risk of contact. So one thing that we've asked, and I'm not sure how it's going to fall out, but we kind of looked at it as, if there's an existing farm in a high risk area, what mitigation tools can we use in that area to make sure that producer is going to be successful, but we don't endanger any of our wild sheep? And that's the biggest struggle, because basically they're all on winter habitat, right? So as those sheep come off the mountains and into that winter range, or the rut takes place, that's a higher risk of contact. In the Kootenays, we come into the South Okanagan, the sheep aren't very high, they're all in the valley. Well, the valley is pretty well full from Vernon down to the US border. So those sheep are almost a little bit like mule deer. They kind of come into the residential components between Penticton and OK Falls. So how do you mitigate somebody that's got 2 or 3 sheep? And that's the identifiers. I've asked for, one thing I have asked for is some clarification around what determines a producer and what determines a hobby farmer. Because to me, in my mind, a producer, that's going to be a harder one to deal with. There's going to be more impact on a producer. If it's somebody that's got sheep to do X, and I guess I could dive into that classic example. There was a gentleman that we worked with that had 3 sheep on his property to keep the grass down. So the first thing that was suggested, we got to fence the guy's property. So I said, well, has anybody talked to him? He said, no. So I talked to the gentleman. We came up with a solution. And again, we just got those pictures, I think 2 days ago, right? Of 36 sheep going on that gentleman's property where those 3 domestics were. So that's the kind of stuff we need to determine, is how do you deal with the people that have 2 or 3 sheep, or whether it's, I don't want to use 4-H as an example, because I don't think we've ever had any issues with 4-H, but it could be potentially some of those things where there's 4-H in an area and potentially they're in a high risk zone. So we want to look for a high risk zone, a medium risk zone, and a low risk zone. High risk, if there's sheep living there, you're going to be in a high risk zone. Medium risk, you could be separated by a geographic river, mountains, whatever. And kind of touching onto the GAR order, we kind of took that 50K buffer. Well, we're not going to get 50K down south between domestic sheep and wild sheep. So that's where that amendment kind of comes in those risk zones, Kyle. So that's the biggest thing I think we could look at for our sheep down south along the Fraser. To me, in my mind, if we go through what we're doing and the amount of money we've spent trying to clear Moby out of those wild sheep, we almost need an exclusion zone along the Fraser River corridor on both sides of that river in order to make sure that those sheep stay safe.
So how many domestic producers, hobby farmers would that affect? So if you had an exclusion zone, let's say you ran a 50K exclusion zone along the Fraser, how many people is that affecting? Is that going to push people out of there, or how does that work? What does that look like, Chris?
So from what we know right now, and said, of course, it's evolving because people, COVID changed some dynamics where, people got sheep or goats because they needed something or they wanted something to do or keep their kids busy. But as far to our knowledge, we're not knowing any sheep along the Fraser corridor right now. I just did get an email today about some sheep in Clinton that are really close to some ewes and lambs. And again, the report was, again, this is not substantiated, but there was ewes and lambs there, and the fellow drove through, and then there's no lambs there now. It's just the ewes. So, anyways, that's kind of off topic, but I don't think it would affect that many producers. It could be the person that has goats that are making cheese, or they're doing their odd, they like lambs, so they've got one or two lambs to raise them up, and then they slaughter them for meat in the fall. So that's the ones that we're not catching. Those large producers, they're not moving around, so they're kind of set up. So it's those unknown 2 or 3 that are there that we don't know about. So from Lillooet to Williams Lake, there's going to be something that we don't know about, Kyle, but maybe 10, maybe 15. I'm not 100%.
And there's policies that we can put in place, right? People can be grandfathered, that if they have existing sheep, they're grandfathered. And again, we talk about this low, medium, and high risk. If there's a high risk farm, there's policies that we can put in place, like maybe testing and make sure that there is no MOV or other diseases in these sheep. And if they have a healthy herd and there is interaction, but there's no disease, then our wild sheep are still protected by it, right? So, and that's something we'd be willing to work with ag on. Obviously, we put some skin in the game, I think, in that scenario where we have we've worked. I think the Wild Sheep Society BC has a pretty strong track record when it comes to wild sheep and domestic sheep and working with domestic producers. And of course, we've supported the 4-H program, which we're a big believer in as well. So I think there's an opportunity for us to work together and come up with solutions, right? But right now, there's no policy, there's no framework. Somebody could go and set up shop in the South Okanagan in prime wild sheep habitat and have a flock of MOVI-infected domestic sheep, and there's nothing to stop them from doing that, right? So that's obviously a concern for us, and that's one thing we'd like to address.
Yeah, and exactly, that's exactly what happened at Chasm, Kyle. There was 125 sheep, and the guy set up domestic sheep farm right there. And here we, 2 years later, there's a die-off, and like I said, there's 15 sheep left and no lamb recruit. So that's exactly the concern we're talking about.
So with the government, if we set up, if they were to identify low, medium, and high risk in southern BC, what would we be looking for in those high risk regions, areas? What would we be after? Are we after fencing? What sort of protocols would we like to see ideally, basically, and ideally legislated, a policy or a framework around that where, it has some regulation around it? What do we want to see? What are we after?
I think you touched on it right off the bat, Kyle. I think the first thing to do is if somebody's in that area, we've got to go and do some testing to say, okay, are you Moby free, or have you got Moby sheep in your flock? If you've got Moby, if you've got a flock of 20 animals and you've got 2 or 3 that are Moby positive, obviously we'd want you to get rid of those animals and make sure, and then retest your flock, make sure you're Moby free. Once you're Moby free, then you've got to follow those protocols of biosecurity, which are in the Manlove paper. Any new sheep coming in, make sure they're tested, make sure they're Moby free. You don't bring a ram in from another herd that's untested to breed your ewes. So there is some semantics around what people can and can't do. And obviously in a high risk zone, you're going to have to undertake a little more due diligence to make sure you can maintain that movie-free status. And then, Helen's a big proponent of electric fence without riggers. Guardian dogs are another one. Put some of those other mitigation tools so we can potentially keep those wild sheep away from those flock. Even though they may be movie-free, we still want to have that extra insurance in there. So those are the tools that we'd be looking to use in a situation like that. When you get into a medium risk, I still think we should be looking at testing. We still need to know what's on the landscape, just in case you have a one-ring ram coming there. And if you are movie-free, then it's not a death sentence for that ram coming in. But if you're in a medium risk area and you're movie positive and that ram comes in there, then we should be requesting the COs to go shoot that ram immediately before it gets back to the main population. So those types of things are critical. So I think high and medium risk, we should be first and foremost be looking at testing, know what's there, know the prevalence, and then we start to use those other tools of those levers.
So it's been mentioned a few times about testing. What's involved in the testing and how long does it take to get results?
So in the testing, draw another parallel again with COVID, right? It's a nasal swab that goes deep into the nasal cavity. They do both nostrils deep in, goes back in a vial. We send it to the lab in Abbotsford, and usually the turnaround is 2 to 3 weeks, depending on how many samples they've got in there. So in about a 2-week period, you're going to know whether you've got any positive sheep in there. So I think it's about $35 to get the tests done, and it's $5 for the actual swab kit. So if you're comfortable doing your swabs, then you'd be able to do them yourself. Obviously, we've had, some people in certain areas doing swabs for us on domestic farms, and we've done some stuff with 4-H where we swabbed some of their sheep and got results back. And again, it's just an education thing, right? The biggest thing around, whenever you try and present something new, there's always that fear factor. So if we can remove the fear and the cumbrance, people don't think it's a cumbrance on them, then, oh, okay, well, that's not a big deal. I can do that. I'd like to know that I'm going to be safe and I'm not killing wild sheep.
So the testing is quick to do, results are relatively quick, and it's cost effective.
Exactly. Yeah, totally, Steve.
So Chris, let's just back the bus up a little bit here. What we talked about the domestic producers. What's Wild Sheep's policy on this? Is the Wild Sheep Society BC against domestic producers? Because I've heard that before. I've heard domestic producers say they feel like we've attacked them, or we don't want them around. What's Wild Sheep Society BC's policy when it comes to domestic producers?
I've taken the same view as Kevin. We can both coexist on the landscape. So it's just a matter of, you have to get into that. There's certain, and I'm not quite sure, there's some producers that are still hanging on to that. They don't think this is an issue. They're not buying into the science, but yet there's other producers, we had one producer reach out that lost her lamb crop to Movi in domestic sheep. And she reached out to us, a Wild Sheep NGO, what can I do for my domestic sheep? So there's producers out there that want to make sure they're movie free. We've got 2 producers there that we're looking at potentially as what Kevin touched on was that science-based component is, can we treat domestic sheep with an antibiotic without having to cull those sheep if they're movie positive? Again, we still haven't been able to complete those trials because COVID came along and kind of stalled it. So hopefully later this fall, we'll be able to do that science-based component on 2 farms. And if it works, that's pretty exciting news. But the drug they use, you can't use it in the States. You can only use it in Canada right now. So there's some nuances with the drug that we're using too. So again, that'll have to be sorted out.
So I guess that's one of the things with, the domestic producers is that, we do support, the Wild Sheep Society BC does support healthy industry. We want to see them prosper as well. And I've heard some people concerned that they have a hobby farm and they have maybe 1 or 2 sheep and they're both Movi infected. And now you come in and you test them, and ideally you want to cull them or something like that. So, and now it's someone's private property and their private land. So there's concerns there as well. But, that's where, we certainly support the industry. We want to see, and we respect people's private property, but we want to see provisions in place that we're going to protect wild sheep. We just need that separation, right? We have to find either protocols to separate them or make sure that the sheep in these high risk areas are healthy. Some way to determine that, because we don't want to see these die-offs is our big concern, clearly. So
yeah, and that's that definition I think is key with producers, Kyle, that they're large. And I don't want to use a number. I have a number in my mind between a definition between a producer and a hobby farmer. But I mean, we've actually offered to help producers and try and actually, one of the things we've said to ag, we can help support the industry, right? They have, and I have to apologize, I think there's 25,000 domestic sheep in the province. I think the Domestic Sheep Federation only has, and I have to be careful here, but I think they have 125 members that represent that. Now, those producers are going to range in size from probably 20 animals to 500 animals to the largest producer in the province. But they only have, I think, potentially 10% of market share. So, to me, there's an opportunity that we can help promote the sheep industry. If we can get the safe protocols in place, we can help promote that. We know our members are going to buy in. As hunters, we all use a wool product, right? What better way to say, is your wool wild sheep safe, for lack of a better word? If you could get Sitka or Patagonia, our wool's wild sheep safe, or our meat is wild sheep safe, whatever, again, I'm cautious using that term. It's one that we coined. But generally, that's what we're looking for, right? If you could go to a restaurant, so, something similar to the tuna market, when Ocean Wise came into play, right? If we could do that and have restaurants in Vancouver say, okay, where's your lamb coming from? Is it detrimental to wild sheep? That would be huge, right? But then we're promoting the industry, right?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's part of this, is working together, right? We want to find solutions where we both benefit, right? We want to see the wild sheep thrive. We want to see domestic producers thrive, and that's certainly high on our priority list. We certainly don't want to curtail the producers. We want to see them thriving as well, right? So any solution we can do working together is obviously a win-win. So, but at the same point, here we are, and we've got another die-off starting, right? We've got 2 lambs. These baby lambs were put down. They were obviously running around, and there's a picture of that on our website. And we can maybe share that in the show notes here, but of a lamb that was running around with, they were tested positive for a MOVI, and they, biologists, when they see animals that are affected by a MOVI, one of the most effective ways is to remove them from the herd, because the problem is it can infect the entire herd and continue to cause a larger die-off. So we just had this in Vassal Lake. So it's just 2 animals. So why do we care? Why do we care? Why are we so concerned? And why are we worked up again with this minor die-off with just 2 lambs? What's the issue there, Chris?
So the issue with that is usually lambs usually get it from their moms, right? So it's usually a shedder mom that's passing it on to those lambs. So if those lambs are dying and they've got it, potentially it's in the adults. If it's in the adults, it may not be killing them, but then we've lost our lamb crop. So in Vassal already, I talked to Andrew this week, we've lost all of those lambs in Vassal. We know we've got some sick sheep in Penn They haven't tested any of those sheep yet, but they have collared and tested some of those ewes in the Vassal herd area. So, once we get those results back, it'll be interesting to see if the MOVI is in those adult sheep. If it's just in the lamb crop, I think that's going to be a really subtle nuance that we've never seen before, that a lamb potentially has had contact and then spread it through that whole lamb crop that's there. So it's that's the nuance there. So the results coming back are going to be really critical for us.
Okay,
So
I just, sorry, Kyle. I just want to step back a sec. I made a quick note when Chris said ocean-wise. It triggered something that Wild Sheep Society has in place. You've got the Wild Sheep Friendly program, if one of you can speak on that.
Yeah,
Chris, you're up.
yeah, I think that was something me and we talked about it before, and it actually came out of us working with 4-H. So as we move forward, we thought, well, maybe we make a nuance of that from how do we get people that are on board. So obviously, our first Wild Sheep Friendly was business was Ben Barakoff, Canadian wildlife catcher. So as we move forward with Wild Sheep Friendly, we could definitely apply that to a domestic producer if they're, following those protocols. If they're in a high risk area or a medium risk area, they could follow those protocols and fall into that Wild Sheep Friendly. Then it gives us the opportunity to promote them as well, right? So that's kind of that Wild Sheep Friendly program. I'm going to let you add a bit more to it, Kyle, because I know there's some nuances there, right?
Yeah, well, the biggest thing is the specific protocols that individuals have to make to qualify for the Wild Sheep Friendly program. But basically, the key is people that are taking steps, and we currently don't have any domestic producers that have qualified for it. We have worked with some domestic producers that have done some great work. They've gone through testing, and there's been a number of treatments that have been done, which we talked about earlier. Again, COVID put the brakes on that. So unfortunately, there were some issues around that because we couldn't get the veterinarian, Helen Schwanschel, who was doing the testing, and she couldn't get out to do the testing, retesting on these trials. So it was potentially a land-breaking study for us, but we've had to put the brakes on it. So again, science is evolving. We're catching up on it and on these treatments and seeing how we're doing. But we are really keen to work with producers, and there will be some that would qualify for Wild Sheep Friendly, but there are certain things. There's testing that would have to be done, and then there's the biosecurity aspect. Obviously, if a number of sheep have been tested and they're MOVI-free and disease-free, and then you bring in a MOVI-infected animal or an untested animal, that destroys that biosecurity, and that whole flock is effectively potentially reinfected. So those are some of the issues that we run into, but we definitely, it is an opportunity for producers to work with us, and the Wild Sheep Friendly is obviously a fantastic program for that. So now, Chris, one thing I wanted to talk about was moving forward with the producers is the 4-H work we're doing, and what's the reason for that, and can you talk a little bit about why that's so important to the Wild Sheep Society of BC?
Well, it comes back to education again, Kyle, right? And with 4-H, we're educating the next generation of producers. So as knowledge is gained, we want to be able to share that knowledge. So what better way to do it with 4-H kids, and they're the ones that are inquisitive and want to know about this and that, and so that's part of the reason we've done it. 4-H hasn't had a lot of support either, so I think they get some support from the ministry. Minister Popham stepped up with some funding for 4-H last year, but we need to be looking at the big picture moving forward. So with 4-H, those we really focused on the IP as kind of our 4-H location and those show animals, and how we can support the classes that those kids are in, and even purchasing some of those lambs. And again, we use those lamb purchases for Jurassic Classic, for our board meeting dinners. We've actually served it at our convention, just to show our members that lamb is, it's a good fare. So, again, if you've only got 10% of the market, you need that opportunity. To me, what do they want to look at? Do they want to get 30% of the share of the market? That would be a good goal for me. If you can get 20% growth, that means you've more than doubled. Well, that's the numbers we can share with 4-H. But I'm going to take, Sabrina Larson has been the one that's been going to the IP and actually engaging at the IPE and having those kids and spending that whole weekend there, talking to people, talking to other producers, talking to the kids, and sponsoring those classes and really giving us a presence at the IPE, which I think is another venue where we get into, I always say we're preaching to the converted, for lack of a better word, when we talk to our members or other hunters. But when you're talking to the general public, that's an opportunity to get in front of another source of public where we wouldn't actually have any outreach or any interaction with. So I think there's over 100,000 people go through the IPE in that 3-day weekend. So what better venue to educate the public as well as 4-H, with potentially saying that, you know, we're not trying to use those kids. We want to educate those kids. We'd like to see that expanded. We'd like to come up with a package that we could share with 4-H throughout the province, which we're going to rely on ag to do that. That's something that's in our ag component, to say that they can direct 4-H BC to say, you know, we'd like to have a little nuance or a program around the education on MOV and how these, you know, next generation farmers coming in are going to be aware of that, of the disease issue and our wild sheep populations. And, you know, we had a couple of essays done by some 4-H members early this year, and we both, the winners of those essays, both got a lamb. They actually had their 4-H project already, unfortunately, but they ended up with an extra lamb to just bring along, which we actually sponsored. Right, we generated that connection by buying a lamb earlier and having a producer actually look after that ewe for a year. We pay a fee to have that ewe looked after, and then she had 2 lambs this year, and we gave them to the kids that gave us the best essay. So that's that 4-H nuance. So can you imagine if we had a program like that everywhere, where we had an essay coming in around Moby from 4-H kids all over the province, you know, to grow the program.
Yeah, and on top of that, I think through the IPE, it's is it in Armstrong? Is that where it's located?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the IPE is in Armstrong, and we work with the Armstrong 4-H Club. And I think all their lambs, that club did MOVI testing and was ensured all their lambs were MOVI free. Am I correct in saying that?
Just some of the lambs. I mean, basically when you get to 4-H, Kyle, is you're looking at some of those lambs are just going to go to slaughter right away.
Yeah.
Because it's just a source. Those sheep or lambs have been raised healthy, and then they've got to have X fat on them that the judges actually look at them, and so they're really good quality lambs that those kids are producing. So basically what we were looking at when we were trying to test the majority of those sheep for 4-H is just find out a prevalence of what's at the fair. Regardless of whether they're positive or negative, it didn't really matter, because most of those lambs went to slaughter for meat purposes. So it's more, again, that education component, reducing that fear, saying, oh, I've got to kill my sheep, than knowing what's on the landscape. So it's a multi-serving tool by just testing those sheep. It doesn't really matter ultimately whether they're positive or negative.
Okay, sounds good. One thing I want to just segue to, Chris, is now costs associated with MOV and disease and that sort of stuff. So, quite often domestic producers will say to us, well, testing's expensive, it's a burden, and there is some pushback, and I can understand in some capacity having to take these extra steps and these extra costs. And I think there's a bit of a valid argument there, but let's just contrast that, and let's just talk about a little bit about our Region 3 and Region 5 Fraser River test and unfortunately in removal in these cases as well of wild sheep, and some of the costs associated with that, and what MOVI looks like on the landscape and the costs involved.
Yeah, and we've talked about that one too, Kyle, and I think I mentioned it to you as well, Steve, but I mean, the cost comparison trying to move MOVI from wild sheep compared to domestic sheep is dramatically different. So the Fraser River project, for people that aren't aware of it, is we underwent a prevalence study, not this year, the year before, so a year ago March, and the regional bio. So we worked with the regional bios to actually get this off, and then there was 3 partners or 4 partners involved in the original prevalence test. I think that one was like $85,000 just to collar some sheep. Actually, more than that. I think the helicopter component, the sampling and volunteer time was 85, and then Wild Sheep Society BC purchased the collars, which was $57,000 just to purchase the collars on those for those animals. So we put the collars out, we did the swabs. And I say we, the regional bios, they did all that work. We got those results back. Yeah, we have Moby on the landscape. So what the next steps were was, okay, how do we, can we clear Moby on a herd? And I'll just back it up one sec, Kyle. I think the partners are really critical. Wild Sheep Society BC, Jurassic Classic, which you're involved with, was a huge funder. Midwest chapter of Wild Sheep Foundation, big supporter. Some HCTF funding. I think I've covered most of them there. But those are the key partners. WSF jumped in this year. But again, it's all NGO funding with in-kind from government, but it's in-kind from the regional bios. It's not government actually saying, hey, we have an issue. And, Steve touched on the caribou thing earlier. Government stepped up at the last minute with caribou, and look where they are right now with that. It's NGOs funding this stuff, the science right now. So this year we went into that test and removal program, and I think that was another 140,000, Kyle? I'm just trying to remember.
Yeah, I think that's what the number, yeah.
So just to do the prevalence and the removal, we're into 250, 270K on 45 animals. So the herd that we tested and removed, there was 45 sheep that they tested. 11 were positive, 11 were euthanized. And hopefully we're going to see that lamb recruitment this year come back to more than at least keep 11 on the landscape to replace the ones that were euthanized by removing those shedders that were positive. The other big thing of that is some strain typing too. There's multiple strains of MOV out there. Some are more lethal and more virile, and some are less, don't have an impact, as much of an impact. So the strain typing tells us, okay, we've only had 1 source of contact, or we've had 2 sources of contact, or 3 sources of contact, depending on if they've got different strains within the serology. So that information will come out of what we did this year. So that's where we are right now. We're going to see what year 3 brings. The regional bios want to do a herd just south of the one that we treated this year. They want to do another treatment south, closer towards Lillooet, which would give us basically the west side of the Fraser River from Lillooet north. It's potentially Moby free if this works, or reduction in Moby. It still doesn't stop any sheep crossing that river. It doesn't stop a domestic producer coming in this year and putting sheep right smack dab in the middle of the sheep. And then you get onto the domestic side, trying to remove it out of a flock. Like I said, we talked about the test. It's $5. It's $35 to get the results back. If the treatment things work and the drug, we can use the drug, then that's one nuance. To treat animals, I think with the drug is fairly inexpensive. I think it's around $5 to $10 a sheep. Again, it's a bit onerous on them to do what they're doing, but those are the components. So you start to use those figures. It's $250,000 to treat 45 animals, and you take 45 domestic sheep. Testing components are the same, but if you're using the drug to treat them, or even if you did get down to culling 5 animals at $250 to $350 an hour, depending on that animal, to replace it, the numbers just don't jive in that sense, right?
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. So just, obviously we have this problem with domestic and wild sheep, and we want to do the right thing. We know domestic producers would like to see a solution as well. What can we do? What do we need? What's the, there's no I've heard Gray Thornton from the Wild Sheep Foundation say this several times around in Moby. There is no silver bullet, but what are our next steps? Where do we go from here?
I think the biggest thing for ag is, is if we can get ag to put some policy and regulation in place and around that idea. And I'm thinking of the high, medium, low risk zones. Try to look at that, help producers out. If we're dealing with a large scale producer, again, that's going to be a different situation, but we're going to have to rely on ag to help us drive that bus, right? We've done as much, like I said, I started off with Flinroe 20 some years ago. Tom Ethier was in Penticton at the last Vassal die-off. He went to Victoria, was the director of Fish and Wildlife. He moved up the chain fairly high in Flinroe, and now has been transferred over to ag as the ADM. So Tom is very educated on the disease issue. He's gone into ag. I'm really hoping that Tom is going to help finish putting us over the edge, that we end up with policy or regulation or whatever that may be, or whatever that nuance looks like, to get us there, that we can have something in place to help save our sheep.
Okay.
There we go. Forgot to take myself off of mute. We've got some wins when it comes to disease transmission with government. We've seen in the last couple of years that government has put in restrictions that you can't hunt with aid of a goat or a sheep or a camelid as a pack animal. This year we've seen Region 4 get rid of any baiting for ungulates there to stop chronic wasting disease from getting into the area, because as we know, it's, last I heard, 15 short miles away from the BC border. So they're still not doing too much when it comes to Movi, and that's why we're going to send out an SOS starting tomorrow. If Kyle, that's something you can speak on pretty expertly, I'd say, in the line of work you're in when it comes to SOSs and sending out calls. So I'll let you speak on this.
Yeah, for sure, Steve. So, as you know, the Wild Sheep Society BC has been at the table. We're part of the sheep separation program led by Jeremy Ayotte. We've been sitting at the table with domestic producers, and we truly believe that they do want to find a solution. We've met with the Minister of Agriculture, and Minister Popham has been fantastic in her support for us. But the frustrating thing is nothing's happened. We haven't had a breakthrough. We haven't had any commitment from agriculture or any policy or any framework to deal with this issue. So, with this recent Vassal Lake event, we've got another disease event in BC. And at some point, it's going to be the big one. There's going to be a mass die-off. We've had them recently in the 1990s. We've seen it in the Fraser River ecosystem. And if you can imagine, the stone sheep in northern BC are quite congruous, right? They're a big group of sheep, and they're all kind of tied together. They're highly mobile. They're not fragmented like in southern BC. So if our northern BC sheep got infected, it could be devastating. We could lose literally thousands of those sheep. And we, again, back to what Kevin referred to earlier by Dr. St. John's study there, that we have the one true stone sheep population in the world. So we have a responsibility to protect those sheep. So, we're asking our membership to support leaning on our government. And we're starting a program on Monday, August 17th called Save Our Sheep. And this is a province-wide campaign. And basically, it's an engagement opportunity to reach out to your local representative. We're asking you to basically do two things. We want you to contact your local MLA, and we want you to raise your concerns about wild sheep and the lack of legislation and protection for wild sheep in the province. So that's step one. And then step two is we're going to ask you to write 3 letters. We put 3 form letters on our website, and we'll distribute this via social media as well. And there's one to your local MLA. You'll have to do the heavy lifting and figure out who that is, get their information. But we have the letter prepared for you. And then we have a letter prepared to the Minister of Agriculture, and we have a letter prepared to the Premier of British Columbia. And we want you to send all 3 letters. We've got 950 members. We'd like to see every single one of you do that. And we're going to ask for other organizations wildlife conservation groups in BC to step up and support this as well. And basically what we're doing is we're going to ask for the provincial government ag to support a strategy to protect the wild sheep of British Columbia. And what we're looking for is a policy framework that's going to support wild sheep, and as well as certainly respect the needs of the domestic producer. So we're asking our members to get involved. We are going to send out a mass email around this, and make a meeting with your elected official, get in touch with them, and sit down and raise your concerns. We have talking points, again, on our website. It's on, if you go to the page of our website, it's wildsheepsociety.com/help, HELP. So wildsheepsociety.com/help. And you'll find a comprehensive package there on what we're asking you to do. And really, it's the two things that we'd love to see. And ideally, if you have the wherewithal, we'd love to also see you reach out to your elected official, your local newspaper, and consider writing an editorial. Again, we're giving you talking points to raise, and we're encouraging the government to sit down with us like they are now. We're currently at the table with the Ministry of Ag and the domestic producers, working on this framework. But what we want to do is push this along. We've been sitting there. We asked this in April of 2018, and we've been at the table, and there's still been no legislation. So we're asking you to up the ante, get your local MLA involved, let them know how important wild sheep and wildlife are to you in British Columbia, because the last thing we want to see is another mass die-off. These 2 baby lambs that they had to put down in the South Okanagan, it's just disheartening. And it's one of those things where if we put these prevention strategies in place, we have a good chance of stopping that. There's really no reason there should be another die-off. So that's the goal of Save Our Sheep. We're sending out an SOS, and we're asking for your help to do that. So that's kind of an overview, and that's kind of where we're sitting right now. And we're just asking for the support of all our members and any other concerned citizens that like seeing wild sheep on the landscape. So,
yeah, don't hesitate to reach out to Kyle, myself, Chris, or even message our Facebook page and say, hey, I need a little bit of help. I don't quite get it, or I want a little bit more, and share and interact. That way it hits your social media feed as well. This campaign will be going out to media quite heavily. As you might have seen, Chris was all over the news the last week. Media is interested. Media has asked us to keep them updated. So the stronger our voice is on the social media platforms, the stronger our voice can be to government. So we're looking forward to your support. Thankful for it.
fantastic, Steve. Chris, do you have any parting words on the campaign or anything to add there?
No, I think it's been a great effort from both you and Steve, just trying to compile this together and just that direction. Obviously, all three of us have been talking for the last, we started talking about this prior to us going away in mid-July before this disease event started. Just about ramping up our social media and our contact component. So my hats off to you guys. I think I just wanted to flip back to though, Cal. We didn't really jump about our stone sheep and that GAR order. So the GAR order just covers the crown land component. But again, you just touched on, if we have a disease event in our stone sheep, it's going to be devastating. So I said earlier, in the interview, when we're talking in the Zoom cast about stone sheep, we're almost our low-hanging fruit, but really that should be BC's due diligence component globally to make sure that that is front and center. Caribou are throughout, they're in Sweden, Finland, throughout the rest of Canada. Stone sheep aren't. Stone sheep are in BC. So the government, however they want to tie this in, need to be protecting our stone sheep. We need to be protecting their habitat, and we need to be protecting them from risk of contact. So that's, because it's kind of geographically removed. But one thing we are seeing is, Kevin was talking about how the nuances of each jurisdiction have done certain things. Northwest Territories brought something in that there is no domestic sheep or goats west of the Mackenzie River. So basically they've taken steps to make sure that their Dall sheep and their Dall sheep range in Northwest Territories is safe from domestic contact and a disease event. The Yukon brought in an order where they test, and anything positive, those sheep are supposed to get culled, because there's a time lapse between the testing component and when they get rid of those sheep, or whether they're supposed to be culled or whatever. So what's happening is some of those MOBI positive animals, goats and sheep, are coming into BC. There's some goats that actually ended up in southern BC from the Yukon. So the Yukon did something proactive, but they left a little loophole that producers or the people that had those animals are coming south into BC. If those end up staying somewhere north, it could be catastrophic, because we already know they're MOBI positive. And when AG's taking a proactive approach on this, they're actually putting something together, for that. But those are, again, the nuances of how people work around certain things that are out on the landscape. So I think it's our stone sheep should be front and center. Our bighorns, again, they have been front and center because of what's going on. And I think, just a final point, if you want to document a large scale die-off, I think there's about 4,500 sheep on the Fraser River ecosystem, but it's 1,500 now. That's almost 70%, right there, that have disappeared off the landscape. So it's same as what Kevin's talking about in Hell's Canyon and other jurisdictions. So I think the significance is there that we need to be doing something.
Yeah, good point, Chris. And so just for our listeners, there's something that pay attention to what Chris said there. Chris said that the Yukon has disallowed infected animals from being brought in. So we had a member contact me last week when this stuff came out with the Vassal Lake, and they said there was an individual that went to the Yukon and they brought, I think it was llamas, I'm not sure if it was llamas or goats in, and they were tested and they were MOBI positive. So they wouldn't let them in. So they kicked them out and they sent them down, and they're now in the Lower Mainland. And goats. It was yeah. So so interesting enough, our government is allowing that. Our government is putting our wild sheep at risk, allowing these animals. Meanwhile, another jurisdiction won't let them in. So the interesting thing to note here is BC, in the wild sheep community, I know the Wild Sheep Foundation's always said that BC was one of the leaders when it came to conservation and dealing with disease and that sort of stuff. Yukon just kicked our butt. Yukon has taken, went from here to here, and we're still down here, and we haven't done anything. And that's why we're upping the rhetoric around this and our concern regarding this, and why we're doing the Save Our Sheep campaign, is because we've fallen below the grade here, and we need to be more proactive. Things like that, bringing MOBI infected animals into the province can be prevented by our government. There's no reason why they can't put a policy in place for that. And the Yukon's doing it, and we've fallen behind there. So, and then I just want to segue back to that GAR order. So we talked about our northern stone sheep, and Chris raised that, and that's another concern. And we're asking to reach out to the Ministry of Agriculture, and that doesn't concern the government action regulation order that we're talking about. That's a northern BC region, and that's actually under Flinrose jurisdiction. But basically what they've done is they've taken, it was written back in 2018, and it was a government action regulation order that basically asked for three things, and I'll just share them quickly with you. They allocated an area, and was it 7A or 7B, Chris? Was it 7B?
It started off actually in Region 6, and then I think it's 7A is the northern region. Is 7A the northern region? I was getting mixed up.
I think 7B is. 7A is Dominica.
Steve should know.
Yeah.
I think it's 7B, right? So,
yeah.
So regardless, this government action regulation was written, and basically what it said, it was three things that were: the use of domestic sheep, goats, or camelids is prohibited on range tenures, in range tenure agreements, and for vegetation management, silviculture treatment within the thin-horn sheep specified area. So that's 6 and 7B. Salt or mineral supplement blocks placed within thin-horn sheep specified area will be in an unused condition. Basically, they need a new one, and may not be predisposed to contact with domestic sheep, goats, or camelids. And hay and feed, the same thing, basically, right? So a pretty generic scenario, and one that would have had a very positive effect for our northern wild sheep, for our stone sheep. But why isn't it in place, Chris? What's going on? Why isn't that was 2 years ago? What's happening?
So in Region 6, it was, like I said, you were exactly right on the money. It was supposed to be signed cross-border. We didn't think there were any issues with it. Region 6 regional manager signed off on it. It came to 7B, and the regional manager didn't sign off on it. He didn't want to sign off on it. Now, I'm not sure of all the reasons, so I'll be cautious on how I word why he didn't want to sign off on it. He thought there may be some limiting factors there, and in our mind is what could be more important than preventing a disease event in thin horn sheep in a global scenario. So whatever reason he didn't want to sign off, I do not believe it should be trumping that GAR order. That GAR order should be signed and be in place in Region 7B right now. And I think that, there's a nuance. We've been talking about ag and Minister Popham. Like I said, she's been fantastic to deal with. But here's an opportunity for Flinro, and where is Minister Donaldson stepping up and saying, why is that GAR order not been signed and put in place in Region 7B to protect those thin horn sheep? So, if we wanted to have a really strong worded letter to Flinro to really apply some pressure to Minister Donaldson and say, why is one of your managers not following suit and really realizing what's happening on the landscape, regardless of whether you're more interested in forestry, mining, whatever that may be. But I'm obviously Flinro is forestry, but I'm at a loss for words. What would trump that signature?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's some of the challenges we're facing as the Wild Sheep Society BC. Some of the things that we're concerned about, and the things that we've been seeing happening at a government level that we feel it's pretty transparent. It's a plan that's in place that would protect our stone sheep, and just an opportunity for the government to step up and make a real difference for wildlife, instead of getting in a scenario where we are now with our mountain caribou, with our northern caribou situation, where we're facing extirpation, and certainly in the south on caribou, and now the northern populations are at risk as well. So we obviously don't want to see our wild sheep go there. We're doing what we can as an NGO, and we just feel that the government has to find a way to step up to put these policies in place to protect our wild sheep, and that's where we're asking for the support of our membership through our Save Our Sheep campaign. So this is a call to action for our members to gather together, get your family members, anyone that cares about wildlife. And if you like seeing wildlife on the landscape, whether you're a hunter, whether you're a non-hunter, whether you're a vegan, if you like seeing a wild sheep when you drive through the Rockies and you want to see them there 10 years from now, you need to act. You need to get involved. Go to our website, wildsheepsociety.com/help. And there's a complete package there on what needs to be done. And we're asking for the support of our membership, other NGOs across the province that care about wildlife, and just the general population as well. So that's kind of where we're at right now. Do you have any last words, Steve or Chris, before we sign off?
No, all good. Just appreciate everybody watching, listening, and stepping up.
And what we'll do is for the first three people that actually meet with their MLA and let us know about it, we'll send them some free Wild Sheep Society BC swag. We'll send you a hat or a t-shirt, whatever your choice. So let us know once you've got your meeting with your MLA. More than likely, they're not going to meet with you one-on-one because of COVID right now, but they'll probably meet with you via Skype or Zoom, and that's fine. You can get your message across. But for the first three people that get in touch with us, that have a meeting with their MLA, we'll send you some swag, and hopefully we can get 900 members or 950 members making the phone calls, getting these meetings, and sending these letters out. And if the government gets 1,000 letters, they're going to pay attention. They're going to have to do something. So let's all rally together and work on saving our wild sheep of British Columbia. So with that, I want to thank you, gentlemen, both. I wish you a wonderful Sunday afternoon. I appreciate you taking a couple hours to sit down and address this important issue with us.
Yep, thanks, Cal. I was just going to say that, whatever we do for wild sheep, the kind of that indicator species, whatever we do for wild sheep helps mule deer, moose, elk, all those other species. So if you're not a sheep person or a sheep guy, or you're not interested in sheep thing, well, it doesn't really make any difference to me. It does. Sheep will benefit those other species. So just keep that in the back of your mind as well, that it's not just, we are very sheep centric and sheep focused, but it's a big picture when we come to it, and it really helps all those other species as well. But I'd like to thank you guys for the time, and Kevin as well. It was a great afternoon, well worth the great topic and discussion.
Fantastic. Thanks, guys. Have a great weekend, and appreciate your time.
Thank you.
All right.